Now we're going to talk about some of the sensory differences that you may see if you have a child with autism or a neurodiverse child in the pool for swim lessons. Let's first talk about sensitivities. This is a very common thing that we see where a child will be very sensitive to either sound or to touch. Let's start with the sound. Now, the issue is not typically that their ears are just more sensitive to sound, it's that their brains are not filtering out background sound. And so everything's coming to them all at once. I want you to just take a minute. Listen to everything in your environment. Right now, I can hear the buzz of my computer. I can hear the cars going by outside. Occasionally, I hear my dog barking in the background. These sounds are happening all of the time, but I'm able to filter those sounds out and really just focus on what it is that I want to have my attention on. And what we'll find with our kids is sometimes that filter is not working that efficiently for them. And so they're bombarded by all of these sounds all at once. And their brain isn't telling them this one's more important than that one. Everything comes in with the same level of importance, and it gets overwhelming and it gets hard to really listen. And so one response that they'll have sometimes is reasonable, which is to just shut down, go into themselves, and just shut everything out. Because as soon as they turn on the sound, they turn all of the sound on. So sometimes they'll turn the sound off and just kind of go into their own world. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we can't change the fact that there's going to be a lot of sounds in our swim lessons. There's going to be kids laughing, some kids crying. There's going to be the noise of the pool and the splashing and the parents up on deck talking and everything going on around us. But what we can recognize is that it might be harder for our neurodiverse children to pay attention to a lot of long, complicated verbal instructions. So I want you to just think for a minute. How would you normally explain to a child that we're going to glide off of the wall? You would use so many words. You might use some sort of cutesy phrase. You might sing a song with them. You'd get them all in the correct position and you would describe to them what's going to happen. And then you want them to do that action, right? With a child that may be sensitive to auditory input or have a language delay, it would be so much more useful if you cut out all of the extra words, all of the extra explanation, and try to use just a few short phrases and also do more showing than you are telling. So show them the position you want them to get in and say, do this, or hold here, or try like this. Just these little short phrases instead of this long, complicated explanation. And that will make them more successful with understanding what you're saying. Another thing you can do is create phrases for your swim lessons. I like to have certain phrases that I use over and over and over again so that the child can learn that when you hear this phrase, this is what's going to happen. It's very useful if they have a bit of a hard time understanding language. For example, I might say, blowing bubbles is all done, and every time a skill is done, I say it exactly like that. Kicking is all done, and they start to understand that when I say that, that means that we're not going to do that anymore, even if their language isn't that well developed. So coming up with those phrases, or like 3, 2, 1, blast off, or ready, set, go, and using the same phrases over and over again. Oftentimes that makes it more effective for our kids that are either kind of shut down to the external world or are just having a hard time processing language. Another sensitivity that we see is sensitivity to touch or tactile input. So this is where it feels like if you just brush up against me, for a child that is sensitive to touch, that feels like you're like pounding into me. And so oftentimes our kids will have exaggerated responses to light touch, where if you kind of touch them lightly in the back, they're going to be like, oh, like this, or they might even like strike out, because sometimes, depending on how sensitive they are, it might even trigger a fight or flight response in their nervous system because they are just that sensitive to touch. So what are we going to do? Our swim lessons have so much touch involved. The first thing you want to do is to try to limit accidental or incidental touch. If you can do it without touching, do that first. I really like to create what I call a swim island, which is just either a platform or like a swim step that you can sink into the water, so that I can put the child there and I know that they're contained. They're not going to be all over the place. They're going to be contained and focused on me. But at the same time, I don't have to have my hands on them all of the time. So I like to have something like that set up for them. And then if I am going to touch them, I try to do it in a way that is less threatening. So if I'm coming in to touch you like this, that can feel a little bit more threatening than if I'm coming in towards the side to touch a child. Also, I try never to touch them from behind without them knowing it. And then finally, you can use firmer pressure instead of light touch. So just like you like to have a nice massage, but sometimes if someone is light touch, that will feel tickly. It's the same for our kids. So if we use a little bit of a firmer pressure with them when we're touching them, that tends to be more tolerable to the nervous system than light touch. So those are ways you can accommodate for those sensitivities. Occasionally, we have the opposite problem with our kids, where they're not sensitive to touch input. They're actually not sensitive enough. So for them, their whole body feels like they're wearing gloves. Have you ever tried to do anything while you're wearing gloves? I remember I grew up in Texas and it's hot there and I rarely wore gloves. And then I took my first job in Boston in the winter and it was so cold and I was wearing gloves everywhere. And I remember being like, how does anyone get anything done when they're wearing gloves like this? Because you just can't feel what you're trying to do. And our kids that are neurodiverse sometimes have that problem where they just don't feel their body in the same way that you or I feel their body. So that impacts their ability to learn new motor movements. And that's one of the reasons why it's harder for them to learn how to swim than it might be for somebody else. And the way that we work on that is, first of all, just by getting in the pool. Don't you love the way the pool feels when you're sunken in and you just feel the whole water all around you pressing into your body, that hydrostatic pressure? So just being in the pool is good for these kids and it helps them to feel their body more. So the more they're in the pool and the more they're moving, the better they're going to do with that. But also recognizing that learning motor skills might be hard. And so you're going to have to go at a slower pace and you're going to have to do more repetition and maybe scaling back a little bit about what your expectation is that you're going to get done in one single swim lesson. So in summary, children with autism have sensory differences. They might be more sensitive to certain things like sound or touch, or they might be not sensitive enough and they don't feel their bodies in the same way that we do. So what can we do about it? We want to make sure that we're accommodating, that we're listening to their needs, and that we're modifying the way that we're interacting with them to make them the most successful.